Hi, Desi here, and today we're talking about the time trigger and everything you need to know in order to start creating time-based events in your levels. Just a note, this tutorial requires that you already know how to assign group IDs to objects, use a move trigger, and use a spawn trigger. So, starting off, we're here in this empty level I have just created. I've set it to platformer mode, and I have just briefly changed the music. So first, let's take a look at the time trigger. Time trigger is all about giving you a sort of timeline that you can then later use to place events on. So, we're going to, step by step, make the finger dash monster that I am just placing out move up after 3 seconds of playtime pass. So, let's get to it. As I've already mentioned, all it really does is it creates a timeline at an item ID. Now, item ID is not really something I would call an item ID. What I would really call it is a timeline ID. And what it really means is that starting at where this trigger is, we're gonna track time, and this time is gonna be stored at item ID specified here. So, this trigger is not about giving you a whole lot of event data, but it is about giving you a clear timeline that you can place events on with another trigger. So we're gonna start off by just creating this timeline on item ID of 1. And right now this gives us nothing. But what we can do now is we can now use a event trigger to trigger an event on our new timeline. So in the event trigger, we have to set up an item ID of 1, because this is the item ID that our time trigger is using. If you just check here, we have an item ID of 1. So what we can do now is we can reference this timeline of ours here. So we're referencing timeline ID of 1, and then we're gonna want a target ID of 2, and we want the target time to be set to 3 seconds, because this is the moment at which we want to activate the trigger. So after 3 seconds pass from the start of our time, right? And now lastly, we are activating group of 2, right? So what's there to be at group 2? At group 2, there is to be a move trigger. So we are setting up a move trigger. It has a group of 2, so that it is a target of our event. And now let's just briefly set it up so that it moves the player by 2 blocks, our monster, right? Target group ID of 3. And it's a it's a spawn trigger, because we are spawning it from an event. It is not gonna trigger naturally, it's gonna trigger by event. So now, we're here. Our trigger is targeting group 3, so the last thing to do is to set our monster to group ID 3. And right now what you will see is this monster will go up 2 blocks after 3 seconds of playtime pass. There we go. Now that our basics are out of the way, let's talk about a little bit more of an advanced usage of this. So what you can do, instead of just triggering time at a universal time, which is just, gonna trigger 3 seconds after you click play, right? You can instead have this timer start when something happens. For example, the player goes up to a specific place in a level. So in order to do that, what we're gonna do instead is we're gonna start this time trigger as paused. And here, right now, nothing's ever gonna happen. These triggers are not gonna do anything because our timer is not tracking time, right? It is paused at 0 seconds. However, what you can do to then start up this timer again is you can use a control trigger. We can place the trigger. Let's say that we want to control right here. And only after the player passes this tile is our time to start, really. So then we can just make our control trigger bigger so that player cannot really go over it. And let's see what we have here. So here, we're gonna click, and we're gonna really, all we're doing here is at touch trigger, we're starting up the timeline with an ID of 1, right? The item ID 1. And we're not stopping it, we're starting it. So, what happens now instead is this monster of ours is not gonna go up anytime until I trigger the time to start, right? So now when I control this, 1, 2, 3, and there we go. One of the most powerful and also mind-blowing things you can do with a time trigger is you can actually set the time that you're tracking to be persistent across player deaths, meaning that your time is not gonna be reset when the player dies during the level. In order to have it work like this, what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna place an item persistent trigger. So let's do that. And now, if we go edit object, we're gonna be presented with a few options here. So first of all, it asks for an item ID. Once again, might you remember that in our event, we have an item ID of our timeline set to 1. So then, we're gonna come back to our item persistent. And in here, we wanna once again give it an item ID of 1. So we are referencing the item ID of 1, which is our timeline. Let's set the timer checkbox to true, and let's the persistent checkbox. Let's set that as well to true. Right now, this does not work just yet, just because the moment our player starts the game again, the time trigger triggers again. So in order to fix this problem, we're gonna once again go to the time trigger, go edit object, and we're gonna enable don't override. This will make that trigger really only take effect if it has not taken effect yet in our previous life. So now, let's just edit the event so that it's easier shown to, let's say, 6 seconds. And now you'll see I'll die roughly after 3 seconds pass, and then only after the next 3 seconds pass in our other life we get, on our attempt 2, our monster is already gonna be going up. And now let's see this in action. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there we go. We have a persistent counter that works across player deaths. So, to top this video off with a meaningful example, I wanna show you how to make a wall that's gonna kill a player if they take too much time in a certain section of a level. So right here, what we have is a wall at ID 3 that's gonna start moving when the timer hits 3 seconds, and the timer is started when this control trigger that is tall is hit. We are starting item ID 1, and here we have an item ID 1, once again, time. And now, one more thing I want to show you is that the timer can actually be displayed by you and shown to the player as well. So in order to do that, you're gonna want to find in a 4th tab or a 5th or 6th if you have less rows here. You wanna find this 0, that is a special type of text that is displaying values, in-game values. And what you can do here is you're gonna once again want item ID of 1, because that is where our counter is. You're gonna want to check time counter checkbox, and whether or not you want this to be seconds only or with decimals is up to you. I'm gonna leave it on decimals. And now let's see this in action. At first, our timer is at 0, and once I hit this trigger, it starts going up, and now the wall is chasing me. So if I get hit, this is game over for me. But my spikes didn't move. Anyway, you get the idea. And time trigger is really fun. and I'm gonna be experimenting a lot with it myself, and I hope you will be as well, and keep creating. Peace out.